Oh, yes.
Yeah. So my big thing has always been, I just really love watching those like high speed, highly technical boxers, right? So Sugar Ray Leonard was that and more, and then just kind of a unique style that way too, right? So coming into current, I don't know if this counts as current, but Manny Pacquiao, kind of the same reasons, right? Just freaking phenomenal footwork, phenomenal handwork, crazy speed, and a guy who just produces power 4 times his size.
Mm-hmm.
Super current, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I've kind of gone more to the MMA side of things, so I'm not as up on like real current.
So we talk about MMA from time to time. Who's your favorite MMA fighter?
I mean, all time, if you include all time, Don Fry, man, you just can't. Like he's a
great
absolute beast, right? Like, so
a good topic for today's discussion, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, who doesn't remember like the Yoshihiro Takayama and Don Fry fight, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
just murder in the ring, right? So,
yeah. I don't know if you remember that, Andrew, by name. But that is I'm sure you've seen the clip where the two of them have each other by the back of the head and they're just wailing.
Yeah.
Unloading.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the old school. And then, new school probably. I don't know, man. I like the Irish guys. I was a big Conor McGregor, GSP in that kind of era. If you call that modern still, I know they're still kind of in and out. But yeah. So that's my answer.
What's you there, Andrew? Let's go with the atypical answers. I like that. Let's stay away from because we're both huge fans of Ali.
Yeah.
So we'll stay away from the cliche.
Either Pernell Whitaker or Tommy Hearns.
Very, very good.
Different styles, but both one of my favorites.
Folks, you couldn't get much. More different.
Yeah.
All right. It's hard. I'm such a boxing nerd. I go all over the place. I think if I have to be pushed to it, man, I did love me some Marvin Hagler. He was something. And Sugar Ray, when I was growing up, Sugar Ray was a big deal. I remember Ali when he was fighting, but obviously I only remember his second act.
Right.
I'm not old enough to remember him in his prime, but still Ali was a cultural icon. I remember that. And Tyson was a cultural icon. People don't understand, like when they talk about boxers now, they don't understand the fury that surrounded Tyson at the time. It was something to watch, but I won't say him because he's another typical one. But certainly, it's hard to give him the edge, but I'm going to give old Marvelous Marvin the edge just because I think he had the better name. And currently, I'm a big fan, although it's strange because I just said Hagler, and he's not often given a lot of credit for his technical work, but I thought he was very technical. Is probably right now is Lomachenko, maybe Inoue. Lomachenko, just because he's got this dedication to greatness, and it's bit him in the butt a couple times, but he wants to be great, and he's chasing the best fights and the biggest fights. It's hard not to like old school guys like that. All right, what do we got here? Here's a good one. Boxers who are on the verge of greatness currently. So what I mean by that is somebody who's either coming on to greatness, who has a reputation, but maybe whose resume doesn't deserve it, but is on the verge, or somebody who is just up and coming, who's on the verge of exploding through. You got any ideas there, Andrew?
Give me 1 minute. I gotta think. I just gotta think for a second.
You say you've fallen out with boxing a little bit there, Cody, but have you got any input on this one?
You know what? I'd honestly probably be a crap one to answer, but I know Will Alvarez has a lot of really strong pushes, like back in 2020 and things like that. And so, you know, he's probably who I know to be one of the top ends of like achieving
Right.
greatness, and a lot of it probably from what he's already done. You know, I mean, there's a lot of people who talk about him in the same conversations as Floyd Mayweather, right? So, yeah, I don't know. That would probably be my best bet, but again, I'm probably not informed enough on it to really make a good. I'm probably going to catch some shit in the comments for that.
Well, I would actually. It's funny because I would actually place Alvarez on in a strange place between where maybe the experts would put him and where the general public would put him. I actually think that the general public thinks that he's on the verge of irrelevance.
Yeah, and this is why I was thinking that I
I
was
don't
probably going
think
to catch
it's
some shit.
I don't think it's fair because he's only really he's not super active. He's lost he lost against Bivol, and that seems to be really knocking the court of public opinion on him. But I actually don't think it's fair. But if he loses another fight, he'll definitely be falling out of favor with the public, and they won't care as much about him. It's a shame because I think he's another one that's chasing greatness.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But for me, guys like who are on the verge are two specifically is Inoue. I think that he's getting the resume already, but I don't think that he's been general public knowledge. And I think now that he's starting to move up in weight class, and there's talk about him moving up to fight Gervonta Davis, will never happen.
No,
he's a natural 140, 147. And Inoue fights just moved up to 122, so I don't see that ever happening. But the fact that people are talking about it shows that they're starting to learn his name. A couple more big wins for him might involve moving up a little bit of. Hopefully, it doesn't turn into a Lomachenko situation where he fights too big, but it's happening for him. And the other one I think might be a strange one. I might take it in the comments for this is Crawford. I think Bud Crawford, his resume has never really matched his reputation until recently when he dominated Spence. I think now he's on the verge of real greatness. If he can take a couple of these big fights, maybe take Charlo, maybe instead of all the moving up and down, maybe clear out your own division, but unify your own division. But that's current boxing. Nobody wants to unify. They all want to move up and down and take that champion and this champion and that champion and whatever. But
that's a fair one.
A few more big names, and I think he's legitimately on the verge of all-time greatness. Have you got any there, Andrew?
I think one that's sneaking in right now is Frank Sanchez.
Oh!
You don't hear him ever. Nobody talks about him in the competition there, but he's going to sneak his way in. I see it.
You might be right on that one. I think it's a little too soon to say he's on the verge of greatness, but you're not wrong. He's quietly,
on the verge of the verge.
Yeah,
he is. He's making some noise. I mean, I don't know if you heard about his last big win was against Efe Ajagba.
Oh yeah.
Ajagba has just recently taken the Continental Championship, WBC Continental Championship. So it's that only helps Frank Sanchez's case that he beat that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good name. And a name to keep an eye on. Like I say, maybe not quite on the verge there, but like Cody says, he's on the verge of being on the verge.
Yeah.
That's a good choice. I like that one. That leads us right into the next one. We'll start with you there, Andrew. Any who fairly or not? He has. There's been
after
nothing.
That Sanchez fight, you haven't heard his name once.
No, but he did win the Continental Championship, so he's still moving forward. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was his most recent fight, actually. I hadn't heard about it until afterwards either, but so it's been very quiet.
Yeah. Loma's been in the verge of irrelevance.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree on that. He'd be one of my big choices actually, because he's, as much as he's chasing greatness and as unfair as it is, he's got 2 losses now, even though the first one, we know
He
the story
avenged
behind
it.
that. Well, he didn't, but it was
No?
no. It was basically his welcome to the big leagues moment.
Uh,
Because the guy he fought, Orlando Salido, was dirty.
yeah, I
But that
saw
was
that fight.
honestly, it was a good way to fight him, because he came from the amateurs. He had almost 400 fights in the amateurs. He wasn't used to it being dirty like that, and
Yeah.
that was now he's become used to it now, but that was his welcome to boxing moment. And then he lost to, he's got 3 losses now, because he lost to Teofimo Lopez, and then he
Right.
lost, controversial or not, he lost to Devin Haney.
Right.
But that's 2 big profile fights. People who aren't in the know are probably starting to write him off and care a little bit less.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, that's right. But I think here's one that I think, if I'm going to draw fire, I'm going to draw fire for this one. I think Tyson Fury.
Yeah.
I think he's on the verge of irrelevance, and I think it's for 2 reasons. His unwillingness to take the biggest fights, to make those fights happen, because he seems to be the one, as time goes on, it seems to be revealing itself that he's the one, that he's the problem. And his choice of fights, fighting Derek Chisora, come on.
Well, he fought Dylan White after he fought Wilder.
Yeah.
And then right after he, like 6 months later, he ends up fighting Chisora, who isn't even in the top 10 right now.
He wouldn't even be in the top 20. He's
number 23 on WBC list.
There you go. It's Derek Chisora that was a trilogy fight where Tyson had won the first 2 already.
Yeah.
So why did we want to see that?
There's no point seeing a third.
No, that was a ridiculous fight to put on. And Dylan White, come on. I know he's technically a top 10, but he's so old now. It's not like he's Brazil, but I mean, Dylan White's getting pretty old. I don't know if that's and
it's almost,
what other top 10 guy hasn't beat Dylan White?
And now he's fighting fighting Nagano.
Oh, yes, and that's
on the 28th of October, sorry.
So it's exactly it. So now he's fighting MMA guys. He's fighting guys he's beat twice before. He's just, I think people are getting frustrated with his shit. Pardon my language. It's people are getting frustrated with the biggest fights not being made. Couldn't make the AJ fight. Couldn't make the Usyk fight. In my opinion, his entire reputation right now is based off of Deontay Wilder.
Oh, 100%.
People slag Wilder that he can't box, but man, Fury's making a career out of beating him.
Yeah.
I think that he needs to bring his head out of the sand before he's back into relevance. He needs to fight one of the big 5. Even if it's Andy Ruiz, for crying out loud, fight somebody.
Yeah, even if it is Ruiz.
All right. Let's move on to the next one here. And then we've got a really interesting one after this. Have you got that clip, Andrew?
I do. Hold up.
Okay, so just give me 1 sec.
Yeah.
So for everybody who hasn't seen it, Alexander Usyk just recently fought. Oh my goodness, I'm having a brain malfunction. Who did he fight, Andrew? Thank you, Danny Dubois. He fought Danny Dubois, which, in my opinion, it's not the fight he wanted. He wants the fight with Fury, but Danny Dubois is a top 10 fighter. He's an up and coming. It's a good, dangerous fight, and he took it. And there's, of course, controversy. I believe it was in the 4th round. He got hit with a low blow. I put that in quotation marks because a lot of people feel it wasn't a low blow. And then I think come the 9th, Usyk knocked him out. So there's some controversy as to whether or not took Usyk. I think they gave him like 4.5 minutes to recover. So it was a long recovery time. And Usyk looked like he needed it. So, I mean, there's some criticism. Let's show the clip and we'll talk about it. You got it?
Yep. It should take me a minute. Is it up?
Yep.
Oh, c'est même pas un coup bas.
C'est pas si bas que ça, effectivement.
Non, c'est pas un coup bas. C'est un peu.
From a
Yeah,
different
it took him
angle
a
there.
long.
Another shot right there on the body.
Oh yeah, I couldn't see that when it went by too fast.
We'll play one more time there.
This was a pretty reasonable one.
C'est pas si bas que ça, effectivement.
Non, c'est pas un coup bas. C'est un peu.
I'm not sure.
So here's I've listened to a couple of referees talk about it, professional referees talk about it. I'm a referee myself, taking a look at it. The criticism remains, but as far as the call is concerned, it was a low blow. Now, did it hit him in the groin? Didn't look like it to me. But I mean, it's so hard to tell. I mean, Andrew, if you get hit close to your cup and it pulls on your cup, that can still hurt. You can get hit in the straps to your cup near your junk, and it can still hurt like that. The rule is if the shot connects lower than the belly button, it's a low blow. If it hits lower than the belly button and it hurt him like that, and it didn't hit him in the groin, you do have to think, why did it take him so long to recover? Is he game playing? Is he, you know what I mean? It's hard to take that criticism out of there, but as far as the fight actually happened, it happened, and it was all legal. So, I mean, people who want to be pissed about the low blow, I think it's a matter of coulda, woulda, shoulda. Does it mean that he's soft in the body? Maybe. But he won this fight. That's all that matters, is that it was a legit call. I can't address whether or not I think that it hit him in the groin. Maybe it didn't. It didn't look like it to me. It looked like it just hit him in the lower body. Maybe that the blow pinched his cup against him and that hurt. Who knows? Seems like he was down for quite a while.
Yeah.
So I mean, it does bring into question: is he soft in the body? Maybe somebody else can exploit that, but Danny Dubois couldn't.
Well, and by the same token, with something like that, right? Like when we're getting a low blow call, like on, say, like where we're not actually getting that impact in the groin, but we're getting it on like what the technical definition of a low blow is, and people are upset about that. Like you were saying, I mean, but are you upset about the fact that we clearly, like you were saying, saw some game playing where it's like he's taking the extra time while he's down, they're giving him that extra time for it. So it's like, can you be mad at one technicality and not mad at another, right? And then it's like you're just playing favorites with whose call you were happier with, right?
Yep. Well, and I think what a lot of people are forgetting, because I've not seen this mentioned anywhere, is Usyk is renowned for his cardio, for the high pace that he puts on in a fight. So I'm not sure that it's to his advantage to be taking a long time to let Danny Dubois, who is not known for his cardio. I've never seen him gas. I've never seen anything bad about his cardio, but nobody ever talks about it like they talk about Usyk. So it's a weapon for Usyk. So for him to take a 4-minute rest seems,
it feels like it was needed.
If it's game playing, it seems like a bad decision.
Yeah.
Because the guy who doesn't need a rest is getting a rest, but the guy who might need a rest is also getting a rest.
Right.
So I'm not convinced that it's game playing. These guys are millionaires, and there's millions of dollars at stake. I have a hard time believing that's what happened. Now, maybe maybe he's weak to the body. Who knows? Maybe he's playing a game that I don't understand, but it's I don't think it's much of a controversy. I don't want to put too much more time into this one. Mostly because I'm excited about the next topic. This is, I think this is a really interesting one. And you mentioned a fighter earlier that who would also apply to this. Is fighters like Tommy Hearns and you mentioned Don Fry, because he's definitely another one. The ones who are maybe they're not as ambulatory, or they're not as able to verbalize them, not as their speech is impaired. Were they victims of bad science at the time, or was the knowledge available at the time for guys like Tommy Hearns to not have this kind of CTE effect years after their career?
Yeah, so the first thing I think is important to say is, I mean, at the end of the day, very rarely are we dealing with bad science, right? Very rarely are we dealing with situations where people are victims of a result of the implementation of scientific evidence, right? I think a lack of science would maybe be the better way to address that, or maybe to answer that. Ultimately, a lot of what we understand about concussion now and CTE, or second impact syndrome, a lot of that has become available as a result of the technology that's become available to us, and the ability for us through things like microscopy and various new I'm not a linguist, various new imaging techniques that even now we're really just starting to kind of get to that edge, that front edge of like, hey, this could be something super valuable for diagnosis or for understanding the pathophysiology of concussions. So I think maybe they're more just victims of their time, right? These are just things that we didn't know. These weren't necessarily things that we knew and then ignored in the world of boxing, in the world of football. In fact, boxing and football have been probably two of the largest drivers for the research into concussion and understanding athlete recovery with concussion. So it's a yes, but it's a no, in the sense that, I mean, you know, they were working with what they had. They were working with what they knew at the time. And truthfully, the reality of it is, I mean, at that time frame, you know, when we're talking about the larger associations and stuff like that, they really were just postured as a business, right? So I mean, at the end of the day, we can all look back and see in a lot of situations with many sports that the athlete was just not the focus of the associations in those time periods, right? So it was like, yeah, come in here, we'll pay you huge amounts of money to destroy yourself so that we can make money off of it as well. So I would say victims of their time, victims of the associations, but I don't think it was necessarily bad science. I think a lot of the science at that time was actually still, you know, pretty decent. It was just not on the forefront.
Right. So that's nothing that they didn't possess that knowledge at the time, is what you're saying. So they,
yeah, I mean, we barely possess, you know, if we really, really look at it in terms of like the pathophysiology of concussion and stuff, we're just starting to kind of get an understanding of it. And we'll talk a little bit more later about that as well. It's truthfully, you know, I think we're just getting to a point in the research where we feel confident in properly managing concussion for really the first time ever in the past 10 years, maybe, you know, 15 years, where we're actually implementing really good practices, where we're seeing that incidences of second impact syndrome are actually going down. Even then, it's only under the right circumstances. There's still a lot of public information out there right now that just, it's either outdated or it's just incorrect. And this is even being, you know, pushed by medical professionals, just outdated information about how to manage concussions, everything from chiropractors, medical doctors, physiotherapists. So it's something that, even though we have the information, that doesn't always mean it's even being implemented properly still.
right. I had a question there, and of course, my brain,
I'm long-winded. I just
it's just
railroaded it.
no, not at all. I know what I was. So my question, I guess, and this is one you're just going to have to guess, I guess. It feels like we're seeing less and less in retired athletes, boxers and football players. Less and less of that, you know, slurred speech and can't get around as well. And Is that the result of us fumbling around in the dark and just basically, I mean, because we do have tools as coaches. We have tools. We've got the concussion protocols. We've got, but I mean, as you and I have talked about previously, that's all kind of guesswork. So I'm assuming that it's a fact that that there has been less in the way of long-term CTE effects in older athletes. But assuming that I'm correct, is that a result of just lucky fumbling around in the dark and we didn't really understand what we're doing?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think that's actually a direct result of the efforts of associations and coaches implementing some degree of awareness. Because here's the thing, even when we're not maybe necessarily implementing best practices 24/7, the reality is awareness is way up. Understanding on the general level of the occurrence of concussion is way up. So this is where you'll often hear things like, awareness is the most important part when we're talking about the general public. And that's exactly the result that you're seeing, right? The difference is that we may not see as many concussions, but we're also seeing coaches pulling their fighters earlier in a fight. We're also seeing that happening more often as well. So the well-being of the athlete really has moved forward in the priority line in terms of how we're managing our athletes and how we're just from a coaching perspective, right? So I mean, gone are the days, at least in terms of, an ethical and a good coach, gone are the days of basically just having a walking corpse standing up in the ring. And so long as they're still able to hold themselves vertical, they're still able to fight. So those changes have had a direct impact on those exact things. And even just athletes' willingness to participate when they know they've sustained significant injuries or they know they have problems and symptoms. We've seen that athletes are taking better care of themselves in that regard too. So I don't think it's a result of fumbling around in the dark so much as it is we've just over the past 20 years really, really pushed the awareness of it from a health standpoint. So even if we're not doing the best things, people are at least aware of, to some degree why this happens, how it happens, and can avoid some of the worst situations that those are occurring in.
So I got this is an opinion section here, but when you're looking at, because fighters have always been their own worst enemy. Even back in the day when coaches would just put standing corpses back in the, fighters would they'd be all over it. Like, yep, put me in. They've never been their best advocate.
Right.
Do you think that, because I think I do, I'm going to put it out there, I think that fighters and athletes from today's generation are less mentally strong because now they're giving credence to, not excuses because they're legit, when they're allowing themselves a situation where they can pull themselves out of a fight, because that would never have happened 20 years ago. You'd never get an athlete advocating for themselves. At one point, do you think, as soon as you start turning things down, it becomes much easier? And does it affect your mental strength to say, to self-advocate as opposed to just listening to your coach?
Right. So twofold. I mean,
I'm going to say right up front before I get murdered in the comments that I know that this is an old school attitude that is affected by some pretty toxic opinions. I get that, and I try and avoid that as an older guy. But I'm exploring the topic for all the other old guys like me out there.
Yeah. So I think this is two things. I think one is it comes down to training principles, and two, it comes down to how we impart the idea of mental toughness onto an athlete. So, for example, if we're talking about mental toughness is your ability to just stand there, overcome your system's desire to not get absolutely pummeled or damaged, then in some regards, yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree that we see a decline in the willingness of athletes to put themselves in those potentially dangerous situations. And again, I think that's part of the risk-benefit ratio that we're weighing, especially in the amateur circuit particularly. particularly, where it's like, we're talking about a few $100, not a few $1,000,000, or we're talking about a couple $1,000 pool, prize pool instead of a couple $1 million prize pool, or a couple $100,000 prize pool. So I think it's just a case of, one, we have more information to help athletes better, weigh their risk benefit ratios a little bit more informed, which definitely probably leads to a little bit of that. However, I would also postulate that the argument can be made that them doing that is a sign of mental toughness, in the sense that it's actually what's going to be able to pull them out, make them make a proper recovery, and ultimately get more fights in. So if we're talking about guys and girls who are pulling themselves because they're worried that they're going to jeopardize their career and they want to be able to keep fighting, I would say that we're better off building mental toughness in discipline and determination in the gym before and after a fight, rather than just, conditioning yourself to stand there and take a beating. For two reasons. Is one, the lasting effects, but the other being that at the end of the day, the person who takes care of themselves in the ring is ultimately going to be in the ring more often. So, I think it's better for the sport that, we have athletes who are developing discipline and toughness that way, knowing when to pull back, so that, from a sport perspective, the more people fighting and the more fights that we have, the bigger the sport's going to be. So, having fighters make 5 amazing fights that do huge, big card fights that draw huge crowds doesn't really help the sport all that much. When you're talking about people like, Jake Paul, for example, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he's not good for the sport. It's just that, truthfully, when we look at the numbers, his fights don't actually draw massive following within the boxing community, right? And so it doesn't always lead to evolution of the actual sport, even though he draws huge fights. And he is a good boxer when we look at it from technicality, right? And people are probably going to whine and complain about me saying that too. But when you look at it, he is a good boxer. But the reality is most
depends on what level you're talking about. But
yeah. People are
I'd
still
put him at like the national level amateur. I'd say, and that's a good boxer. There's
it
nothing
is.
wrong with that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, is like, that's better than most guys who are throwing punches in a gym right now. Right.
That's true.
So, I mean, look at it from a perspective of what's going to actually make the sport bigger, what's going to grow the sport, what's healthy for the sport, and more fighters, more fights. That's going to be better for the sport.
I have to say that I do find myself foolishly on both sides of the fence when it comes to big fights. I've seen big fights where there's no pathway to winning. This guy's getting his teeth kicked in, and either they stop it or they're, a good one would be the second Deontay Wilder fight against Fury.
Right.
Where his trainer stopped the fight, and he was so upset. He's like, I want to go out in my shield. And fighters and coaches kind of all get, and fans kind of all get the goat in your shield. Everybody loves that guy who will put it all on the line, and they'll go out in the shield. But how often does that fairy tale happen where they put it all on the line and they're able to pull out a win?
Right.
It's usually they pulled out a courageous loss.
Yeah. And to tell you the truth, like, those kind of incidences, those are always going to happen. We're always going to have those guys. We're always going to have those girls, who are, like you say, just like, put me out in pieces on my shield, lay me in the center, and I'll do something with it. Right. I think that's always going to be there. I think the difference comes in the advocacy of that.
I advocate for guys to, when they stop, I look at it and I think that was smart.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in the back of my
I kind of wanted to see it go. I wanted another round.
I kind of wanted to see it go, which is terrible. The guy made the right decision, and we're looking to see more blood, but it is the nature of the end of the day,
right? It's just a coliseum, right? It's just a coliseum. We're there for blood. And, as much as we're like, I want them to be safe. You want a good fight. You want something to watch that, So at the end of the day, I think it just comes down to making the right call in the right moment. They're all going to be different. Making a generalized statement on something like this is just, you're always going to anger half of the crowd, and the other half is going to carry you on their shoulders, right?
So this is a good time to get into some of the myths and mechanisms of a concussion.
Yeah.
I will say that for a coach, and really, as you know, concussion management for athletes has been left up to the coaches for the vast majority of it. Now, of course, there's a concert with doctors. The very first step of the concussion protocol is go see a doctor.
Right.
But the flaws in the concussion protocol are you can just go see any doctor. They don't have
Right.
to have any real knowledge of concussions more than just a GP. And without testing, you never know anyway. Is it a concussion? Is it not? And I get that it's about, taking the smart chances and not the.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never really been a huge fan of the way that the concussion system works now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of it is that we misunderstand how concussions happen.
Right.
And I honestly was one of those people until we sat down and your wife explained it, how a concussion physically happens. I was one of those sad guys that thought it was bonk, my brain knocking against the outside of my skull.
Right. And this is actually still really prominent. And so, just so people, don't think that I'm bashing one profession over the other, this is unfortunately still in many cases the standard in the base education for all practitioners and providers, which is largely still focused around kind of the 7-step program, which most, coaches, Hockey Canada, things like that use. And it's not that they're necessarily inherently non-effective. There's just better strategies. There's better ways to manage it. And the problem comes down to that, so chiropractors, all medical doctors, and I think all physiotherapists are technically able to diagnose and treat concussions. The problem is that the base education that we get on concussion in school, even now, even though it's getting better, is, in my opinion, insufficient. Basically, we don't go over it in enough depth and detail to actually provide people who are being allowed to manage concussions properly, to manage concussions, to be able to manage them properly. And it's just because it's an incredibly complex pathophysiological injury, a neurometabolic injury. So it's more just a case of we just don't have enough base knowledge at the school level to really, really manage these things effectively. So any physiotherapist, any chiropractor, any medical doctor who has gone out of their way to get further education on concussion management is going to be fantastic to deal with. And of course, someone with some knowledge is always going to be better than no one with none. But the differences that we see in the outcomes of patients who sustain concussions, who are with someone who's done that further education or gained some further understanding, is enormous. It's a Grand Canyon of difference in terms of the outcomes for those patients versus the ones who are just dealing with docs and professionals that are just kind of using their baseline understanding of what concussion is. So this is where things like, in Canada, CCMI is one of the big ones. There's who kind of tout themselves as being like the standard of concussion management. And even there's things that, could definitely be implemented that aren't currently, because the reality is the research just moves so much faster than the clinical application.
Makes sense. So I've got a couple of questions for you. The first one, can you explain for guys like me the actual mechanism of a concussion? Because I think that most people think like me that you take the hit and how your brain bounces off the inside of your cranium on the other side is
right.
That bruising is a physical injury to your brain.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think that's what most of us think.
Yeah. So, and I mean, that was even the medical theory for quite a long time. A lot of people might have heard the idea of a coup contra coup injury, where we're basically slamming against the front of the case of the brain case, and then slamming against the back, and then this idea of physical bruising or damage to the outer layer of the brain, which is the gray matter. And so if we look at the actual organization of brain tissue, what we have is the outer layer of gray matter, and then we have the inner layer of white matter, and then we have another layer of gray matter. So what is made up in that gray and that white and gray is basically the bodies of the neurons, the myelin sheathing or the axons or the long projections of our nerve. And then in the bottom, we have the dendrites, which are basically the little spider legs that kind of connect one neuron to another. And so that white layer of brain tissue is actually where we're sustaining the injury for the most part. And the reason why that happens is because we have a denser, more full gray matter, a lighter density white matter, and then a fuller density of gray matter again. So when we talk about things as an acceleration injury, which is kind of more how we talk about concussion now as an acceleration deceleration issue rather than a coup contra coup, is that those layers overlie each other like that. And so as we sustain an injury, what happens is with acceleration and deceleration is that those larger, heavier ones actually move at a different rate. And so what we get is called waveform movement. So literally like looking at a wave pool, at the water park or something like that, where we have this throwing motion of the heavier densities at a different rate than the lighter ones. So what happens is those neurons that project between the layers get physically and mechanically stretched, and in some cases actually torn and damaged. And then we see patients undergo things like neuronal degeneration, neuronal death. But the main thing that we see is an imbalance of the metabolic state of the nerves in the brain. So in other words, we just have a huge flush of mechanically released from opening those pores in the neurons that just flush the entire brain. And we kind of get the equivalent of like an electrical storm going on in the brain. And so in the initial stages where we have that, sensitivity to light, sensitivity to sounds, it's kind of just that we're so overstimulated already that we just can't take any more stimulation. We've released everything we've got. We've emptied all of our stores, and all of those compounds are being used all at once. So that mechanical shear strain is actually kind of the crux of what's happening. More damage to the nerves between the layers of the brain rather than actual bruising to the tissue itself. So when we really look at it, one of the main things that we're really concerned about with concussion, or that we're tracking to be a big problem with concussion, is actually energy production as a result of calcium. Calcium is really our main problem as far as we can tell right now, in that when we stretch those nerve fibers, we release all of that. We release a ton of potassium into the extracellular membranes, and then we allow calcium to rush in. And so what happens is it actually engorges the mitochondria, as everybody knows, the powerhouse of the cell. So that's actually what happens, and it actually screws up our mitochondrial metabolism, which our mitochondria are primarily responsible for production of ATP, or our body's energy. So energy production, replacement, and re-regulation is really the main concern with concussion, and to our understanding, most of the cause of symptoms of concussion right now.
Well, then that leads into another good question then. Supplements for concussion.
Yeah.
Is it something that will help you in your recovery or in avoidance of concussions in the first place?
So there's a lot of information out there about replacement of what's the word I'm looking for? Minerals, replacement of minerals that we see plummet after a concussion. Two of the main ones are magnesium and zinc. And so magnesium and zinc absolutely plummet. We basically just empty those stores immediately within minutes after sustaining a concussion. So there's recommendations that we make kind of as a baseline of like, these are what you have to have after you've had a concussion, because we just need to replace those stores. So magnesium is a big one, and zinc is a big one. Omega-3s are a big one, particularly for their anti-inflammatory effects, but also to help replace some amino acids. And this one's a little bit contentious. Not everybody will agree with me on this one, but omega-6 is actually something that we'll often recommend in lower dosages as well. And the reason why that's kind of contentious is because omega-6 has been shown in the past to be pro-inflammatory. However, when we have it in the right ratios of omega-3 to 6, we actually see that omega-6 is particularly effective in reducing inflammation and doesn't actually trigger those inflammatory responses. So depending on which studies you're looking at and the circumstances under which omega-6 is being implemented, it can either be pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. To our understanding, the thing we know about omega-6 now is that ratios are everything. So one of the main problems in Western nutrition in particular is that we tend to already have very high amounts of omega-6 in our diets through processed oils like canola and things like that already. So historically, we went from maybe more of a 1 or a 2 to 1 ratio of 6 to 3. We've gone as high as, it's been recorded as high as 20 to 1 in modern diets now. So to my understanding, I actually do recommend small amounts of omega-6 in conjunction with relatively larger amounts of omega-3 in conjunction, because we do know that in the right ratio, omega-6s actually contribute to anti-inflammatory properties and amino acid function. In terms of, the more nutraceutical side of things would be, there's a lot of buzz around lion's mane, and there has been for a while, the mushroom. So in certain circumstances, I'll actually recommend that as well. And the main reason that we recommend that is because it has been repeatedly shown to be effective in producing nerve growth factor. So basically it's going to help rebuild the nerves that have been damaged, help reestablish a healthy baseline. We can get into all kinds of conversations about the nutrition side of things, from everything from curcuminoids or curcumin, the chief ingredient we're concerned with in the spice curcumin and turmeric. But generally speaking, baseline, we're going to be magnesium, zinc, some kind of omega supplementation, depending on what your practitioner understands about fatty acids. And I actually really highly recommend creatine, both as a neuroprotective, as well as helping after you've sustained a concussion as well. And that's because creatine can actually cross the blood-brain barrier as well. And we've got a lot of studies on creatine. Creatine is one of the most well understood supplements on the shelf. So it's something that we have pretty low risk and potentially very high benefit, with a lot of studies supporting its use for neuronal health.
Very interesting. So going to stay on the positive side of things for a bit.
Yeah.
When it comes to treatment.
Yeah.
I want to get into proper recovery time if you've done everything correctly. So I want to put out there, and this is an important one. So for anybody watching, please, please, please remember this portion. Get a baseline.
Right.
Get a baseline done. Am I wrong in so strongly?
No, that's
athletes.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. The main reason why we want baselines is because
can you explain what a baseline is to people who don't know?
Yeah. So baselines are what we use as objective measurements. In other words, meaning raw data rather than opinions about your state pre-injury, so that we have something to compare to post-injury. The reality is without a baseline, we actually see that the diagnostic criteria become a lot more difficult when we're not when we don't have a proper baseline, which means you have a higher chance of being either misdiagnosed or mismanaged. And that's even by trained professionals. Now, there's a lot of things that we can go into regarding clinical neurology and things that we can use as objective measures, whether we have a baseline or not, but they require highly specialized education. And this is a spot often where I will plug the Carrick Institute. I work as an associate professor of clinical neurology with the Carrick Institute, and they're really, in many ways, they're world leaders in the research world in terms of clinical neurology and management of neurological disorders. And so, for example, there who got Sidney Crosby back in the NHL after his big smack, I don't remember how long ago that was now, probably 10 years ago now. But they provide a lot of research and courses for basically how to properly measure degrees of neurological activity, how to measure sympathetic activity of the nervous system, things like that. A lot of those things have actually already trickled into most concussion management programs now, which has kind of been shown in the case of what are often called VOMs, or visual and oculomotor screening devices. But long story short is that baseline measurement is just a series of tests that we do to give you to give us a good idea of what your normal is. And then we have something to compare to afterwards. So it not only increases accuracy, but it also tells us where exactly you're failing. So for example, if we see that you were really good with balance before and you're really bad with balance after, then we can tailor your program to be a little bit more focused on the vestibular side of things. We can look into vestibulo-ocular reflexes, things with how your body balances your body and orients your eyes and how your eyes function in relation to that. If we see big changes in cognition, but all of the other vestibulo-ocular stuff is better, then again, there's some neurological things that we can work with that as well. But maybe we're going to be looking more into some of the nutritional deficits or some of the changes that have happened with that, because everybody is going to experience a concussion differently, generally speaking. And the last reason why baselines are important is because symptomology is a really, really terrible way to judge degree or presence of concussion. So if we're just going by symptoms, we're going to be wrong about 70% of the time. And the reason
and you were saying, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
And you were saying that very often diagnoses get confused with whiplash, things like that.
Right. And this is one of the main reasons why we talk about symptomology, is because generally speaking, within the first week, 60 to 70% of patients are going to have a subjective, significantly improved symptom profile. So if we're just using some of those old methods that are basically relying on, if they do this and they don't have a symptom for 24 hours, they can go to the next phase, and then they do this and they don't. Right. So the problem with that is that most people are going to be, or at least many are going to be asymptomatic within 7 to 10 days. However, they'll still show objective measures and signs of concussion, sometimes weeks after that. So when we're just relying on symptomology, it's we're going to be wrong a lot more. Again, because the diagnostic procedures have improved with things that are a little more objective, like our vestibulo-ocular motor screening and things like that, that's reducing. But the symptomology is a really bad way to just diagnose a concussion. And in regards to not only that, but return to play and misdiagnosis of concussion, symptomology is important, because we see that in the first 3 to 5 days, whiplash disorders actually have basically the exact same symptom profile as a concussion. So if we're just relying on that, we're going to be telling people who have whiplash that they have a concussion and they're going to be going through a whole protocol. It's going to take them longer to get back to sport. And that's not inherently a bad thing. I mean, generally we would rather err on the side of caution and say it's a concussion when it isn't, rather than say it's whiplash when it's not a concussion. But that's the advantage of working with someone who's highly skilled in managing the concussion, is that they're going to be much more capable to say, no, this is a whiplash. We can treat this. You can get back to training right away and we can move you back to competing relatively quickly if we know that we're not dealing with a concussion.
But you had also said, now I was shocked to hear this, that recovery time if you have the proper baseline and you have the proper resources at hand, recovery time is remarkably quick.
It can be. Yeah, it can be. I mean, we've had people who've sustained, a concussion and they're back to hockey in a couple weeks, right? So it really depends on the person. Now, that being said, I've had people where, they take months depending on what their symptom profile is. And oftentimes those people are going to be the ones who haven't seen somebody who's highly skilled in properly diagnosing their symptom profile, or maybe they just haven't seen anyone at all, which unfortunately happens a lot in amateur sport, where it's like, oh, I got a concussion or what I think was a concussion like 3 months ago, and now I can't handle my symptoms anymore. Well, those people are already in the persistent phase. They're already in the chronic phase. And so their recovery time is just going to be longer, just as a result of the fact that, nothing's really been done, because now those changes have been reinforced. One thing we talk about, again, the Carrick Institute talks about a lot in particular, is the plasticity of the brain, which is the ability for the brain to kind of adapt to new environments or adapt to changes in your system. So the reality is it's amazing, because in most cases, your brain's going to pretty much adapt to whatever you ask it to. But on the bad side of things, your brain's going to pretty much adapt to whatever you ask it to. And so it can be a benefit and a drawback. So then we end up dealing with situations where we're having to undo changes that have happened, which are obviously much more difficult than just being able to manage things right from the get-go.
Yeah. So have you got anything for us for just, other than, of course, the mechanism of injury, that was a pretty big one, but are there other myths about concussions that have an impact on fighter safety?
Yeah. So the number one thing is that rest is not the answer, but rest is the answer. And so what I mean by that is that taking people and telling them to just be in a dark room with no screens and no stress for 2 weeks after they sustain a concussion is pretty much the worst thing they can do. That is an almost surefire way to guarantee that we're going to be dealing with persistent concussion symptoms or prolonged concussion symptoms. Generally speaking, we want a few days of rest just to come out of that initial spike in the compounds in the brain. So generally calcium, the calcium influx is going to regulate itself within about 4 days. Even some of them like potassium, magnesium, and zinc are going to rectify themselves in about 3 to 5 days to some degree, if not more. So really, a lot of those things are going to help. Just on their own. They're just going to kind of recover on their own. But this is also why people end up looking asymptomatic within the 3 to 5 days, is because a lot of those compounds and those minerals actually kind of self-regulate. However, the lasting problems are the metabolic processes of the structures in the brain and the regeneration of those connections and interconnections of the neurons that becomes particularly important. So just like anything else, our body adapts to challenge. Our body adapts to stress, just like working out in the gym. Like nobody got 24-inch pythons by looking at the weight, right? So basically we want just enough rest to help people's worst acute symptoms calm down a little bit, couple days, few days. And then we start creating a program that gradually pushes them a little bit further, and a little bit further. And where the professional comes in is that they're going to have systems and measurements that they can use to dictate how much can you push at what time. and how much adaptation can we create in a short period of time. So absolutely, movement, activity, and pushing yourself to a reasonable degree under the supervision of a professional who knows what those values are is going to be incredibly effective compared to traditional models where we're just waiting for things to get better on their own.
So my GP likes to say that motion is lotion.
He is 100% correct, or she. They know exactly what they're talking about. And this is in joints. This is in neuronal tissue. One of the things that we teach in the clinical neuroscience program is that we actually see function and organization of the nervous system is more stable when we activate it more. That's one of the most effective ways for us to maintain the health of the nervous system is to just activate it. So when we are activating the nervous system in novel ways, when we are activating it regularly, we increase the stability of that neuronal network. And we increase the ability of that network to be able to adapt to changes in the future as well.
Right.
So not only is that true for joints, tissues, muscles, it's also very applicable when we're talking about neuronal health and neurometabolic function as well.
That's very cool. So I'm going to get to a bit that I missed earlier, and then we'll get to some very quick Reddit questions.
Yeah.
I didn't give my boxing tidbit for the week, so you're not aware of this tradition, but I collect boxing stories.
Okay.
Love boxing stories. Anything from why is Sonny Liston right-handed to the story of Willie Pep winning a round without landing a punch.
Right.
I'm a big fan of these stories, and I have another one for you. And this one's an amateur boxing story, and it's actually an important one for young boxers to hear. So there was a boxer I just messaged one of my coaching mentors, Rico Mancini, for anybody who knows him, to get this guy's name so I didn't get it wrong. There was a boxer in the 90s. Please forgive me if I'm wrong, especially since I know his coach. His coach was Gord Apolloni in Ontario, who is an absolutely outstanding coach from Top Glove, one of the best out there in the country. But it was one of his fighters, and from my understanding, he was the gym. He was the guy that you sparred with if you wanted to have a good day sparring. We'll put it that way.
Okay.
He had that kind of. Everybody's got a guy that's willing to get in there with anybody, but maybe isn't the best fighter. And that was this guy's role. He loved getting in the ring. He loved it, but he was losing a lot. Well, he had an amateur record of 3 and 23. Just give me half a second. 3 and 22. He was 3 and 22 when he went to Golden Gloves. And we've seen it happen before, Andrew and I, where a guy just puts it together. He doesn't do anything. His skills are the same, but just all of a sudden he puts it together for himself. This guy won the fight, went to the gold medal round, won that fight. That takes him to the Nationals, won that fight. Within 6 fights, he was a world champion.
Right.
This is a guy who had lost 22, only won 3. That's the kind of grind. When people say, what's the most important attribute in boxing? And he's the last amateur world champion that Canada had was this fella, was Michael Stewart.
Right.
And I've got so much respect. People talk about, especially in pro boxing, you lose your they're like, is his career finished? Like, what are you talking about? This guy took 22 losses. And that wasn't after his world championship. That was before.
Right.
And went on to be a world champion level boxer. So when people say what's the most important attribute? Is it strength? Is it speed? Is it ring IQ? I say it's dedication. That guy proves it. He went through the grind. He didn't allow the mental stresses of losing to beat him. And the grind ended up winning him a world championship. Nobody would have guessed that. 3-22. That guy's not winning provincials, let alone. Oh Lord. So that's my boxing tidbit for the week. It's a bit of an instructional, but it's also an interesting story. Yeah. So shout out to Gord Apolloni for using his boxer, and shout out to Rico for giving me the correct information last minute. All right, so after that, I've got one question, and then Andrew's going to read a couple of Reddit questions for you. Frequent hard sparring. What's your thought on by frequent, I mean more than once a week?
Mm-hmm. So the good news is that concussions are actually pretty hard to sustain. When we're talking about forces, we're looking at about, on the low end for an adult, healthy, no comorbidities, we're looking at the bottom end of about 70 Gs of force to induce a concussion. So for example, if we want to compare that to something like jet pilots, right? Fighter jet pilots are basically tested and expected to perform at about 4 to 5 Gs. I think it's 4.2 or 4.6, something like that. So anyway, or somewhere in that realm. So we're talking about an extraordinary amount of force to actually induce concussion. Now, that being said, the problem with boxing in particular is that angular forces are actually worse for producing concussion, in the sense that they're more likely to produce concussion than linear forces, so radial or oblique forces. So what we mean by that is rotational, which is exactly how you're going to respond to a punch to the side of the head, as well as the fact that most punches are not landing straight direct on. We have some degree of glancing or lateral movement that happens with that. And part of the problem with that is because that rotational force creates increased shearing of that neuronal tissue, right? So if we've got a bunch of them hanging down and we're just stretching them, then we've got a problem, of course. But when we stretch and we twist, now we're kind of getting this like cable twisting sort of problem that's now adding more strain as well. So frequent hard sparring, I don't think, is necessarily inherently going to be something that increases the incidence of concussion. In other words, you have a concussion or you don't. We're generally not seeing tons of saying, frequent subconcussive impacts increasing that risk. However, I will also say that some research has shown that there is a possibility of that happening. And one of the things that we see that happening with is with kind of where concussion research is heading next, which is cortical spreading depression, or CSD, which is essentially how we propagate a series of depolarization of the nerves across the section of the brain. And this is something that's been researched in the occurrences of things like migraines with aura, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. So it's something that's been researched quite a bit, but not specifically to concussion a ton until recently. Mm-hmm. But if you think of it, the easiest way to kind of think of it is if you have a still pool of water and we drop a golf ball in and we see that waveform spreading out from the center, that's essentially what's happening in an electrochemical level on your brain. As a result, often of waste product buildup in the brain. So we have a mechanism to flush our brain of the waste products as a result of energy production. Primarily, potassium is one of the big ones that we're looking at with that. We see buildup of potassium, and then there's a reflex in your brain that causes your vessels to kind of flush all that excess waste product out of the brain. Mm-hmm. With a CSD, we're seeing propagation of that depolarization across, and it can happen in the presence of those waste products more readily. So the only place where this may be an issue is if we are seeing further development of waste products as a result of subconcussive impacts. It could potentially lead to more frequent occurrences of cortical spreading depression, which we don't always see in MTBI, or mild traumatic brain injury, which is the category that concussions fall into. But there are cases with repetitive concussive impacts where we see the development of CSD. So my thoughts on it right now would be, and again, this is kind of an opinion based on the literature that I'm aware of. This isn't something hard that I can back up with a study. So keep that in mind. But my thoughts on it would be that so long as we're following safety measures, so long as we have two guys that respect each other and are treating each other in a way, with sparring that, we're not in there to hurt. We're there to develop technique. We're there to learn how to move around and how to take a punch and be able to recover and maintain form. When that's the focus, I generally don't think we're going to see a direct problem with that. However, the research may change on that. We may find that that's something that might pose an increased risk. But to my knowledge, right now, I don't think so. I don't think there's a direct correlation to that. And if anything, in my mind, it would almost be protective in the sense that, again, you always see the worst hits that you see are when somebody gets knocked off balance, they lose their position, and then that follow-up punch comes and just catches them before they even get a chance to recompose. And those are the knockout hits almost all the time, right? Those follow-up hits. So being prepared to defend against those follow-ups, I think, is an important skill. And that's something where, full contact sparring is going to be beneficial. The other reason why that might be good is because we also see that neck stiffness is a really good indicator as to whether or not concussions will occur. And the main reason being that whipping motions or acceleration, deceleration motions are particularly responsible for the induction of a concussion. So if we can limit that whipping motion, we're going to decrease the translatory force that's going to the actual brain tissue. So there's some pretty solid research showing that neck stiffness and neck strength at the point of impact could be a good indicator for reducing concussion.
Well, that's very interesting. That's gone kind of against what some new school coaches like myself, because I don't do hard sparring unless fighters have got a fight coming up.
Well, here's the thing, right?
We do light sparring once a week.
Right. But here's the thing is that, of course, anything where you're increasing the force, anything where you are increasing the opportunity for injury to happen, you're going to have the opportunity for injury to happen, right? So, frequent hard sparring, as though I think it's important for them for skills development, you are putting them in a higher risk. You are putting them in a higher chance of concussion, in the sense that, a small punch versus a big punch is obviously more likely to concuss somebody. So I'm not saying that, yes, everybody should be frequently hard sparring, harden yourself against these things, but scientifically speaking, is it inherently going to cause more concussions? I don't necessarily think so. So long as we're following safety measures, protective gear is going to help a little bit. But again, because we're talking about acceleration, deacceleration, headgear is going to be particularly important for stopping a head fracture or a skull fracture more than it's going to be protective against concussions, so to speak. And this is why,
Right.
We've kind of not stopped, but we've really focused a lot less on helmets in football, because we know that helmets don't really work to decrease concussions.
Well,
so
they started to phase them out in amateur boxing too there.
Yeah, because they don't really help for concussions. They're great for helping stop skull fractures when we have head-on-head collisions in a sport like football, definitely.
For us, it's mostly cuts.
Help. Yeah, cuts, direct impact for fracture, which again, when you're wearing a glove, not very likely. So yeah, that's less going to be important for actual concussion prevention. And again, from a boxing perspective, I don't necessarily think frequent hard sparring is a great training measure overall, if that's a regular thing, strictly for the simple fact that, one of the things that we see a lot of the time is that we're better off dealing with easily recoverable practices, recoverable, exposure, because that means you're going to have more time in the gym. If you don't need to take 3 days off because you got your ass kicked for 2 hours in the ring by someone who's way more proficient than you, you're going to need 3 days to come back. Now you've just lost 3 days of training. Fair enough. it's really a case of that's, I think, more of a coaching consideration,
Right.
more than directly relating to concussion. But again,
That's
to be
fair.
decided, right? To be decided. We don't know exactly what the research is going to show us. We've been wrong many times before. In terms
Fair
of how we
enough.
deal
That's the
with it,
nature of
right?
science, right?
Exactly.
All right. I hate to do this, but we're going to have to scurry it up here because I think Andrew's
Yeah.
starting to panic that he's going to be late for work.
Yeah, I do work today.
So just some, I've got two really quick questions for you.
Yep.
I'm going to get Andrew to read it because I've really simplified it. Reddit Q&A. I've got two of them for you. Slate Sock 1754 asks, how do I tell? Andrew's going to read you the actual question.
1 second. I still have the page written up here.
Yep.
No
There it
worries.
is. So essentially what he was saying, blocking every shot after my first spar back from a potential minor concussion. Nothing contacted me but brief jabs. Then after the session, I back up and hit the top of the wood platform of the speed bag on the tip of my scalp. It doesn't feel like a concussion, but definitely feels like a scrape on my scalp.
Right. So first things first, because we're talking about previous concussion or recent previous concussion, number one indicator is whether you were properly managed for the first concussion. If this was happening outside of a concussion situation and we're just talking about sparring and a couple head bonks, I would say probably not. It's not very likely. Like I said, we actually require quite a bit of force to actually induce a concussion. This is more sounding like something along the lines of whiplash. However, that being said, because we're dealing with a recent and previous and possibly either ill-managed, mismanaged, or not managed at all concussion, your likelihood of second impact syndrome just went through the roof. So what that means is that, without the proper rehabilitation, you are going to be more susceptible. And second impact syndrome is where concussions get really dangerous and getting into the chronic traumatic encephalopathy with repetitive or successive concussions. So the number one answer is you don't tell. You have no ability. You have no idea how to tell. You have zero understanding of how it works. And so at risk of sounding a little bit pompous and cocky here, go and see somebody who knows what they're talking about, because you absolutely don't. And even if I sustain a concussion, I'm not going to diagnose myself. I'm going to go to somebody else because I am not in a state to be able to properly evaluate my performance. And it needs to be evaluated for us to be able to tell. Concussions
It's so funny you say
complex.
It's so funny you say that. I watched a TED Talk once that my mother was, I'm sorry, Andrew, I'll be very quick, where the woman she was a neuroscientist. And she had a stroke. And during her TED Talk, she was saying it was a very interesting opportunity for me as a neuroscientist to be able to examine myself as I was having a stroke. And I was thinking, I'm not the expert, but isn't your brain impaired while you're doing the self-assessment?
Yeah. So it may be
interesting.
Yeah, it may be interesting for you
but I don't know if it'll be salient to anything.
No, it is not going to be a reliable measure. It is not going to be a way for you to properly be able to tell. So
this last question is actually one I've been excited about asking because it's very interesting. Reddit Q&A Ellipses asks, can I get hit somewhere other than the head and still get a concussion?
Yeah.
Sounds like a dumb question, but it's actually quite an interesting one.
No, it's actually not a dumb question. And in cases of sports like football and rugby, most of concussions are actually non-head impacts.
Really?
Because we're not dealing. Yeah, it's an acceleration issue, right?
Right.
Think about from a car accident perspective, when you're wearing a seatbelt, you generally, unless you're the driver and you're smacking your head off of the steering wheel, you're not going to hit your head on much, maybe the padded seat in front of you. So believe it or not, many, and arguably even more don't occur, depending on what sport we're talking about, don't occur from head-on-head impact. They actually occur from blows to the body and the whipping motion and the acceleration that happens to your head as a result. And this is one of the main reasons why we feel that children might be more susceptible to concussions, and what we've seen that they require less force. So on average, like I said, the very bottom end of adult concussion is around 70 G's of force. And the average that we're going to see concussion occurring is at about 90 to 110 G's of force.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's quite a bit. But in children, that number drops down to about 62. And when we're talking about measures of velocity, the velocity that it happens with children is about half of what it is in young adults and adults. And one of the main reasons for that is because children's head size is actually full size, in late stages of childhood. And so we have a bigger head size relative to the rest of their body, meaning that it's going to be a larger mass. Mass times acceleration is how we calculate. And so that means that the acceleration of their head, even without impacts, is actually going to be higher. Now, that being said, specifically with kids, we see obviously children are hitting less hard than their adult counterparts in sports like football and things like that. Usually commitment to a tackle is one of the main reasons why we see that, right? Like adults, particularly adult males, are going to be much more aggressive in their tackling than their child counterparts. So thankfully that kind of balances out a little bit. But when we look at the data, yeah, a lot of the times these are non-head impacts. They have nothing to do with you hitting your head whatsoever. You cannot touch your head and still sustain bad concussion symptoms.
So this is probably one of the reasons why I don't see a whole lot of concussions in boxing. There wouldn't be a whole lot of, other than getting hit and turning your head, there wouldn't be a whole lot of mechanism for acceleration injuries in sports like boxing.
Right. And I mean, the reality is because of the rotational forces that we're talking about, we are creating more susceptibility to concussion. The problem that we potentially run into is more a case of, like we said, once that concussion is sustained, what happens after, right? How things are managed are more going to be a better indicator of the outcomes than what happens in one isolated incident. I can honestly say I don't know the numbers for boxing concussions off the top of my head. So I couldn't tell you if they're more or less, but the problems we run into is that when they're bad, and then they're often mismanaged, and then things get worse. And that's where we get into the persistent or chronic phase of things.
Well, thank you very much. That was a super informative session. I hope everybody got as much out of that as I did. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much, Dr. Cody.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. And if anybody takes anything away from this as an athlete, just understand that the number one indicator in terms of making sure that you return to your sport quickly, safely, is whether or not you see somebody who really knows what they're doing within the first few days after you sustained a concussion. Even if you feel that you are too soon or anything like that, go and see somebody. That's how you make sure you keep competing. That's how you make sure you can keep enjoying your sport. And that's how you make sure that you're not going to create any lasting damage. Best indicator as to whether or not people do well is how quickly they see a qualified professional.
And get a baseline. Get a baseline.
Yeah, get a baseline. You make our job easier, which makes our lives easier, yes, but it also makes us more effective, more accurate, and better able to evaluate you after something has happened.
Say this, I want everybody to understand as well that my son, there we go, right there, is an active boxer. He's got about 20 fights, and I make sure he has his baseline done. Yep. I'm about to make sure that the entire competitive team with us has their baseline done. I think it's that important.
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Cody. We're going to sign off here, and
awesome.
We'll see you when we see you, I guess.
Sounds good.
We'll hopefully see you at the gym.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll be stopping in there soon, actually. So
all right.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
And to everybody else, follow, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.